My name is Petra. I'm from the Netherlands. Years ago, I worked in a home for older people as a nurse. I had the night shift. We were drinking coffee on the second floor when all of a sudden we heard a loud bang, so we thought a client had fallen. We decided that I would take the second floor and my colleague would take the first. Maybe we could find out what happened. While my colleague walked down the stairs, I looked at the monitor on the second floor and saw someone in the department on the ground floor. He was inside the closed apartment. You could walk in there, but you needed a code to get out. People with dementia lived there. We watched for a while, and the guy was stuck, he couldn't get out. We decided to go inside a room on the second floor of one of our clients because you needed a special key to go inside, so we thought that was safer. We explained to her what was going on. She was perfectly capable of understanding the situation, and of course we called 112. I explained the situation. They told me they would come right away. I called my husband, who also had the night shift as a security guard in another town not too far away from us. He was just talking with the cops while I called 112 and said they were on their way. When I hung up, I looked outside and saw that guy climbing out the window, so I called back. They asked if something had changed. The police arrived, and we did a walk-through with them throughout the whole building. The guy broke the door in the kitchen. His stuff to break the door was there on the ground. Police couldn't really do much. I don't even know if they found the guy. Later that day, we heard that they were riding around the building 2 hours before the guy went in. The guy had walked all over the ground floor while we were having our coffee on the second floor. That's a pretty scary thought. The next day I had one more night shift, and though I don't have that much to fear, it was still pretty scary, so I asked if I could bring my 2 dogs. We had 2 Rottweilers at the time, and they were actually okay with that, so I brought them with me the next night. Nothing happened. The dogs walked with me the whole night, and of course I let them outside now and then to do their thing. The other night, 2 other colleagues had the night shift, and guess what? They came back. They had robbed the safe. I always thought that the guy we had was just to look around and see if he could get away, but they had planned to come back for the safe the next night. But I'm guessing the 2 Rottweilers scared them off. I wouldn't go inside if there were 2 dogs like that either if I didn't know them. Later on, I always brought my dogs if I ever did the night shift over there. Most colleagues would be happy if they worked with me because they felt safe with the dogs, and so did I. The funny thing was that the dogs knew the round that we always walked. After a few times, I didn't even put their leash on, they just knew. If we needed to help a client, they just waited in the hallway until I was done. A few clients knew it because I told them, knowing that they love dogs, so when they needed our help, the dogs went with us in their apartment. Both the dogs and clients loved that. In my own personal experience, Rottweilers are known as friendly, but don't mess with them or the people they love, then they'll change. No other weird things happened after that. My name is Seth, and I work as a security guard in Oakland, California. One morning I came into work, and the janitorial supervisor came and talked to me. Let's call him George for privacy reasons. George asked if I knew who was working the night before, and I told him no, but I can rewind the cameras and see who was on shift. I asked what this was regarding, and George told me that his janitorial staff was actually attacked. George told me at around 1 a.m. while the janitorial staff was getting off, a man who looked homeless was yelling and throwing rocks at the staff while they were trying to get in their vehicles. The majority of the janitorial staff on the night shift are all women, and their vehicles are parked right in front of the building that we guards watch over, so we can see pretty much everything outside, and whatever we can't, the camera can catch it. So when George told me what happened, I told him that I would look into it and then write an accident report on it. Once George walked away, I started rewinding the cameras. I rewound the cameras an hour before the incident, and I saw my coworker sitting at the desk asleep, and the janitors still working. I sped the camera until I saw the janitorial staff banging on the door, and my coworker was still asleep. I switched to a different view of the cameras and saw outside of the building where a tall figure was approaching the ladies. One was banging on the door until another janitorial staff, who looked like she was yelling at the other, was banging on the door, and then she stopped banging and then ran away. The tall figure came closer to view, and I saw that he was now throwing and yelling at the janitorial staff. The janitorial staff ran into their vehicles, and one by one started to speed off. I can still see on the cameras the homeless man screaming and tossing things at janitorial while they drove off. After I reviewed the cameras, I then wrote my report and called my boss right away. My boss was furious and then asked who was working at the desk that night and how come he didn't see it. I replied, "I don't know. That's why I called you to see if you know who was working on shift last night." He put me on hold and then took a look at the schedule. It was Mike. That guy always gives me problems, and he always calls off the one night that he should have called off. I wouldn't have minded if I could have got someone who was more responsible and then prevented this from happening. He told me. I let my boss know that I did a report on the incident and told him I'll talk to the janitorial staff to get more details. Once 5 p.m. came around, the janitorial staff came in, and I asked them about the incident that took place the night before. Reminder, the janitorial staff are almost all women, and they speak little to no English. I asked them what happened the night before in Spanish, and they told me some crazy guy had started yelling at them, calling them names, and then throwing rocks at them. One of the janitors, who we'll call Lucia, told me that she was banging on the door to get the guard who was asleep. She was trying to get them to help them, but to no avail. Then one of the other janitors yelled out, "What are you doing? He's getting closer. Forget it. He's not going to help us. Just run to your car." I asked Lucia if she had tried to call the cops when she got in her car, but she told me no. She thought that Mike, who was the security guard that was asleep, but he never did. Later on, George informed me that he was going to report the incident to headquarters and then informed them of our negligence. I don't blame him. The fact that his staff was put at risk and we didn't even do anything, I would have done the same thing. I called my boss again and gave him more details, as well as letting him know that George will be reporting us. My boss just sighed and said, "I don't blame him. Whatever happens, happens. Our job is to observe and report, and that didn't happen last night." Thanks again, Seth. I really felt bad for the ladies, and even though they were afraid, they still came to work and did what they had to do. I ran into Lucia a week later to check up on her, and she told me that she's still scared about what happened and it was really traumatic, but that she has kids to feed and she can't let this stop her from working. So yeah, I guess that's the story. I was a security guard for an old building that the government used. It was a big secret what the building was actually used for, though. Some say it has to do with aliens. Others said it was used as a place to experiment on people. Who really knows? Anyhow, I drove my Honda Civic to the lot. I got out and approached the building. Right away I could tell this wasn't going to be easy. This building had something attached to it. I went from being okay with the job to now being frightened within seconds. I slowly approached the doorknob and then gave it a push. The door creaked open, leading to a dark, abandoned hallway. Papers were all over the floor, and desks were knocked over. As I walked inside the building, I got the sensation that I was being watched. Hello, I called out into the dark. I started to search the first floor, and then I made my way to the second floor. That's when I noticed a key on the ground. It had third floor labeled on it, so I walked up towards the door leading to the third floor. I unlocked the door and then made my way up the steps. That's when I saw about 30 to 60 rooms filled with padded cells. Some of these cells had remains on the ground. I got chills as, for the first time, it clicked that I was inside some sort of hospital for the insane. I knew that I didn't feel right about this building. I heard weird noises, and at first I thought it was just the building settling, but now I know it had to be haunted. I immediately left that floor and then walked down towards the entrance. That's when I heard a loud bang from behind. I turned around quickly and noticed a shadow of a man standing in a doorway down the hall. He was tall and looked like he was wearing some kind of padded vest. My heart started to race. I immediately turned around and walked out of the building. I drove home and never came back. The security company that I worked for was furious, but that was the first time I was ever terrified on the job. I worked as a security guard in Tucson at a hospital. It was one of the creepiest hospitals that I've ever worked at. I remember one night I was doing my rounds and then all of a sudden I heard a loud banging sound coming from the second floor. I took the elevator up to the second floor and walked out. It was pitch dark with only the lights flickering in the hallways. I walked down the hallway to where I thought the sound was coming from, and then I saw a door that was slightly opened. I pushed the door open and found nothing but a dark room. I turned the light on and then noticed a bunch of boxes stacked on top of each other. I assumed that it was probably just the boxes that fell, but then I heard another loud bang coming from the third floor. I ran up the stairs this time, and then stopped dead in my tracks when I saw a figure standing in the hallway. I called out to the person, but they didn't respond. I took my flashlight and shined it towards the figure, but there was nothing there. I assumed it was just my imagination and then walked towards the nurse's station. When I got there, the nurses were just standing around talking to each other. I asked them if they heard any loud noises, and they said no. I told them about what I saw, and they just looked at me like I was crazy. They told me that the third floor is where they keep all of the patients that are violent and that the doors are always locked. I asked them if there was anyone up there right now, and they said no. I got chills down my spine and then went back to my rounds. That night I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I finished my shift and then went home. I never experienced anything like that again, but that hospital always gave me the creeps. My name is Jane, and I worked at Stop and Shop while I was in college. I had a long walk to the bus stop, and it was always late at night when I got off. One night I was walking to the bus stop, and I noticed a man in a car following me. I tried to ignore him and just kept walking, but he kept following me. I started to get really scared, and then I saw him pull over and get out of the car. I ran as fast as I could to the nearest gas station and went inside. I told the cashier what happened and he called the police. The police came and took a report, but the man was gone. They offered me a ride home and I accepted. After that, I always made sure to have someone walk with me to the bus stop, or I would call an Uber. That was one of the scariest moments of my life, and I'm just glad that I got away safely. My parents own a small shop in our town. It's nothing special, just selling regular groceries and food from local businesses. They've been running it for over 20 years, and my dad took it very seriously, keeping the store open until 12 every night and sometimes even staying later. When I turned 16, I started helping out a few hours a week, and when I turned 18, I started working full-time while doing online college courses. This night was my dad's day off, and my mom was having some health issues at the time, so it was just me closing the store. It usually stays not so busy for the last few hours of the night, and there was never too much to stock either. Around 9, almost no customers were coming in. I think only 1 or 2 people came in, so I grabbed a sandwich from the fridge and took a quick lunch break. Of course, right when I did, someone walked in. I made my way back to the front desk and put the sandwich aside, waiting for the customer to finish shopping. First, I pulled my phone out, and after a couple of minutes, I looked up to see how the customer was doing but didn't see him. I scanned the room again and still didn't see him anywhere. Thinking they were maybe in some off angle I couldn't see, I waited a few more minutes, but they still never came into sight. I didn't even hear them either. Feeling off, I walked around the counter and started looking through the aisles. It didn't take long to find them in the second aisle. A man was crouched down at the end, staring at the floor and not moving or making a sound. Sir, the man immediately looked up at me, then stood up and continued to stare at me. All I could focus on were his eyes. They were wide and full, kind of in an unsettling way. But after a couple of seconds, he quickly walked away and out of the store, never having spoken a word. Once I saw him leave, my first reaction was to check where he was crouching to see if there was any reason to be there, but there wasn't. I mean, that whole time he was just crouching in the aisle. It kind of freaked me out because of how odd it was. I went up to the front door and checked that he fully left the area. Obviously it was dark out, but I didn't see him anywhere. I then went back to the counter and stayed a little more alert. 3 hours passed, and not a single customer came in. It was now time to close up, and after so much time passing, I wasn't thinking about that man anymore. I was just ready to go home. I walked up to the front and locked the door, then grabbed my bag and started walking toward the back door to leave when an extremely loud bang screeched through the store. I stopped in place, knowing it had to come from somewhere in the back, and it was so loud that I had no idea what it could have been. Worried, I slowly walked to the corner and looked down the back hallway. At the far end, dust was scattering through the air as the metal back door was loosely open. Standing right in the hallway was that same man from earlier. He was staring at me with the same wide-open eyes. I didn't know what to say or do. It was like I was just frozen in that moment. Despite his clear determination to break in, he didn't look angry. He had no emotion at all. I took a few slow steps back, then ran for the front, leaving the store and running to the other side of the street, calling 911. I called my dad too, and he rushed over to make sure I was okay. The man at the store was gone when the police got there, but he left behind a sledgehammer sitting on the pavement behind the door. At first sight, nothing looked to be missing or stolen, so his intentions are anyone's best guess. It's clear he was unstable though, which means he could have been planning anything. Thankfully for me, I didn't have to find out what that was. I'm a warehouse worker for a small business in my city. I'd been in and out of jobs for a while, so this wasn't really a career or anything. I just did what I had to do every night, and that was it. Specifically, I had to unload pallets of shipments that came in and put everything in their designated places in the warehouse. Super simple job, and most of the time I just put in earbuds and listened to music while I did it. With the warehouse not being too big, very rarely would there be another person working overnight with me. That would only be on the holidays, but this night was just a regular night. I came in, counted the stock, then put my headphones in and started unloading the boxes from the shipments. I started at 10. It was probably sometime between 12 and 1 a.m. when a knock echoed through the building. I took my headphones out and listened, but didn't hear it anymore. The building was old and would creak and groan throughout the night, especially when it was windy outside, but what I thought I heard was clearly someone knocking. I walked down to the back of the building and looked around, then went to the front. I didn't see anything inside, so I opened the front door and looked outside. The parking lot was empty, and the night was still and quiet. I shut and locked the door, then went back to work, thinking I must have just misheard it. Being more cautious, though, I left my headphones out for a bit. 20-ish minutes went by before I heard something again. This wasn't a knock, though. It was more of a single thump coming from the front. I hurried down the hallway and up to the front portion of the warehouse. Nothing was there, no signs of anything wrong or anyone at the door. I knew what I heard this time, though, which is why I got kind of nervous. I stood in the middle of the room for a moment and just looked around, silently listening and looking for something, anything to be the cause of these noises. Standing there, I got a bad gut feeling, just that something wasn't good about this. I walked up to the front door and leaned on it to look out at the parking lot again, but as I put my weight on the door, it swung open with ease. I stumbled forward, not expecting it. It was almost as if the door wasn't locked or even latched at all, yet I had checked and locked it not even a half hour ago. I looked at the door, then saw the latch lying broken on the ground in front of me. My stomach tightened, and I felt my adrenaline suddenly spike. Not even a second later, I heard the faint sound of footsteps echoing from the dim hallway behind me. I quickly went out the door and into the parking lot, still in a dazed and unsure state. Once I was a good distance from the door, I turned around. Barely visible through the glass door, the shape of a figure walked up to the other side. They moved around for a moment, definitely looking at me, then they walked away. I called the cops as soon as I could and waited in the parking lot, but never saw any more movement in the building. When they arrived, they found that he'd left through the back door, and it seems like they couldn't figure out anything else to help solve the case. A few things showed up missing, but nothing substantial, and honestly, I think it was probably just from a wrong stock count. Regardless of if anything was stolen, to break the latch, he must have had some kind of tool or weapon, which only makes the whole thing more scary. They also moved the door back to look like it was closed, knowing it would keep me from figuring out what was going on. Maybe if I hadn't noticed the door was broken, I would have come face to face with whoever that man was, and I have no way of knowing how that would have turned out. Although unlikely, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was coming after me for some reason, so I've since left that job and moved on, hoping I don't run into him again. I'm a receptionist at a popular hotel chain in the US. For the better part of a year, I'd been working overnights. This night I was doing my usual shift of 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. It was pouring outside, so I wasn't expecting any walk-ins, and on the schedule it didn't show any bookings starting tonight. On nights like these, my job is to just stay awake and take phone calls or help current customers with any room services or checkouts. We had a coffee machine in the hotel lobby, so I had a cup of coffee next to me as I tried to stay awake. Even having been on overnights for a while now, I still had trouble with getting tired on my shifts. The rain outside made me even more tired as well. But at 1 a.m., a phone call came in. I answered, and before I could even speak, a man quickly asked if we were still accepting walk-ins. Their voice was very muffled though, and there was a background sound that was really loud. "Yeah, we have rooms available for walk-ins tonight," I said. They responded, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. As I asked if they could repeat themselves, I looked up from the desk and saw a small light glowing outside. It was from a phone as someone was holding it up to their ear, standing almost right up against the front window in the pouring rain. Knowing it had to be the man I was talking to, I was about to wave to them, but something about this made me feel uneasy. so I decided to pretend like I didn't see him. A moment later, though, he ended the phone call. I saw the lights turn off outside and the outline of the man moving toward the entrance. The doors opened, and the man walked through the hotel lobby, dragging water across the floor. He came up to the counter and bluntly asked for a room. He was fully soaked and had water dripping from his hair, yet his face showed nothing but exhaustion. I don't know if I'd ever seen someone look so sleep-deprived. I said okay and found him a room, then asked how he'd like to pay for it. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a debit card, then handed it to me. I swiped it, but it declined. I looked up at him only to see he was staring at me. It didn't go through. "Do you have another card to try?" The man didn't respond, holding his stare and not moving aside from a few blinks. As the seconds kept on without any reaction, I grew more and more uneasy. I looked down and put the card on the desk, sliding it back to him, but he didn't even look at it. He turned and started walking away from the desk and toward the hallway with the rooms. By now I knew something wasn't right, so I quickly pressed the button that calls for police, then went out to the hallway the man was in, finding him standing at the door to one of the rooms. He started pounding on it, yelling in a harsh voice for them to open the door. I tried telling him to stop, but I didn't want to get too close, not knowing if he was in some kind of dangerous state. But then he pulled a small knife from his pocket and started trying to pry the door open. I yelled at him to stop, and that the police were on their way. The man stopped for a second and shot an awful glance at me. Then he faced me and screamed at me to open the door for him as he started walking down the hallway. I was terrified and just ran right out of the hotel and into the parking lot. Through the window, I could see him go back to the same door and continue pounding on it. Police were quick to show up, making it inside before the man could get into the room. Somehow they got him, dropped the knife, and locked him up in their car. The person that was in the room came out. It was a kind young lady, visibly shaking and horrified. Turned out the man was an ex of hers that she hadn't seen or talked to in over 10 years. How he got the information on where she was staying and even what room she was in, nobody seems to know. They aren't even sure how long he'd been stalking her for, which is really disturbing. But what he would have done had he gotten in is likely even more disturbing. I used to work at a video store in Los Angeles in the 90s. We had quite a few celebrity customers, even a few porn stars too. It was a wacky work environment that could feel pretty unsafe at times, but that unpredictability was half of the allure. I honestly loved the job and the crazy, unhinged customers that came with it. There was a porn star that would come in frequently. I'll call her T, whose visits I would absolutely dread. She only seemed to come in when I was working alone. She would always ask me the same question: which of my movies do you carry? Now, she didn't ask this in any kind of unreasonable manner. T was a little older, clearly had a whole career behind her. She looked and acted a little crazy, like she was out of her mind, but she was also very obviously high. She'd come in jawing, grinding her teeth together, and her eyes would bulge out of her head like they were some prosthetic special effect. She was skinny from years of substance abuse, probably various personal issues with weight and image. T also reeked of booze and cigarettes most of the time. She would scream, "Which of my movies do you carry?" over and over again with that crackhead energy. I repeatedly told her over and over our computer system would only look up movies by title, not by actors or actresses. But this fact never seemed to get through to her. Every time she would start screaming at me. Remember, this was 1995, so the computer I used to look up things and check rentals was a dinosaur. But it didn't really matter because T would always forget. "How in the hell can you find out which of my movies you have then?" She would scream. I offered to walk her back to the adult section. She could see the stocked shelves for herself, but she would always scoff as if totally disgusted at that idea. This is where it gets bewildering because she's a porn star who's already come into the adult film store. "I'm not going in there," she yells. "Lady, you're already in here. What's it going to hurt to go scan the shelves real quick?" In my head, I'm thinking she's a porn star and she won't walk the aisles and look at the covers. It made me think she was even crazier than she was leading on. What does she think she'd find in there? Just how out of touch with reality was this woman anyway? She would yell at me for a bit before calming down and then leaving. But this scene played out at least a dozen times. She wasn't the worst customer I had, but she came to be the one that I dreaded the most. But then one week she didn't show up. Monday, Tuesday, the whole week went by, and still no tea. It was a huge relief. But part of me wondered if something bad happened to her. Was she getting extra spun out and would come in even more crazy? The reasonable side of me figured that she had. When another week went by without her presence, she left my mind entirely. Fast forward a month or so, guess who comes slithering through the double doors? It's T, and she looks like hell. First off, she clearly hasn't showered for several weeks, maybe since the last time that I saw her. You could always tell when she was really unwashed because her hair would just get more and more vertical. I don't know how else to explain it other than the grease would just hold up this overly dyed, frazzled hair. Her clothes are about the same as always, nightwear and half sporty Valley Mom. All of this is nothing when I see her face though. She has a huge black eye, and her eyes themselves are just completely insane. She's got pupils like dinner plates. The outer rim, instead of white, is tinged with a deep yellow. I can't tell if she's sick or more hungover than any human I've ever seen. She comes to the counter and sparks up that same shtick she always does. "What movies do you have? Where are they? How many copies?" I try to be a little personal and say, "Hey T, it's been a while since I've seen you." We still don't have an updated system that allows me to search those specifics. I can show you the shows that might help you though. I'll never forget the look she gave me. Just this faraway nod, half smile with her mouth all jittery. She asked me if I was sure, which I said yes. Then she started backing up towards the exit. Unsure of what was going on, I figured she was in the middle of an episode. She'd see herself out, probably disappear for another few weeks. I'd heard of mentally ill people being stuck in loops of behavior. Maybe visiting the video store was part of her loop. Boy, how wrong was I though. The door opens, not 30 seconds later, and a big, tall, sharp-dressed guy strolls in. I extend a welcome but hesitate. This guy looks pissed. He's storming right up to the counter. I ask if there's anything I can help him with. He sets his hands on the countertop, and they're bling-studded with all kinds of gold and silver, crusted diamonds in between them. He calmly explains that I'm the problem, and that he's here as a solution. I start to come back with something about how I'm just at work, just an employee here. If he wants the cash in the register or the pornos in the back, he can have them. The guy laughs at me, shakes his head, then explains that I'm just upset his friend who was just in here. Oh, you've got to be kidding me. The crazy, cracked-out porn star who's been pestering me for months somehow secured backup. I tell him that I don't know her at all. She's just a needy customer who wants to find her films. There's not an easy way for me to do that, so she'll just have to look over the titles herself. This guy cuts me off with the wave of his hand, says he knows. He's heard every word. He's heard it so many times that he feels like it's happening to him, and now he needs to get involved. It turns out T was pretty much what I pegged her for. This guy was clearly gang or drug related, maybe even a kingpin. He acted like he was T's handler, almost like a pimp or something. She was so old, there was no way he had her tricking. I mean, I guess there's a market for anything, but I got more of the vibe that he had a relationship with her and for himself. Whatever the case, it's now my problem. I'm looking up at this Coke machine of a man, deciding if I should hit the security button. This is just a video store, so part of me didn't even think that would work. But it was down at the other end of the counter, and if I moved, this guy was going to snatch me up for sure. He states T's full name, then her stage name. They were similar, probably more similar than you'd want them to be. I realized then that T was probably pretty easy to look up in the phone book if you were clever enough. He then asked me, which movies do you have with her in them? Obviously, he didn't want the same excuses I'd given before. So I threw my hands up in defeat. I logged into the computer beside me, pulled up the inventory list of the entire store, and started doing it the old-fashioned way. I jotted down a short list of titles that I recognized and just started from there. It took me almost an hour to find every single tape, constantly double-checking the shelves and discount racks for hidden copies. The whole time, that guy just casually followed me around, not saying a word, just watching me gather them all up in a tub on the counter. He'd crack his knuckles, roll his neck, textbook intimidation stuff. It was like a scene from The Goodfellas. It was only after I started to pile up all the tapes that I realized just how extensive T's career was. She was a mainstream actress for like 20 years from what I could tell, and had been produced by some of the bigger studios throughout the decades. It occurred to me that this crackhead burnout probably still received checks for some of this stuff. Now the guy behind me made sense. As I said, I did it. That was it. I told him it'd take me a minute to wring them all out. He asked what I meant by that. I said a charge for all the films. I explained I couldn't just let 80 or 90 tapes disappear from our store. The guy picks up the bin of movies with one arm, slides a pistol out of his waistband with the other, looks me up and down, sets the barrel on the counter, then asks me if we're good. I just nod with a sigh, tell him to take care. I called my boss after I saw them leave the parking lot, who in turn told me to call the police. Both of them showed up 20 minutes later. The police took a statement and my boss filed a report of robbery, then fired me right there on the spot. I've thought a lot about that guy, who he was, and why they wanted those movies. I work in retail, and there are only 5 of us that work in the store, including our manager. We are a very, very tight-knit family, so we naturally have each other's backs for anything and everything. Tonight, my coworker and I were minding the store, and he needed to leave early for a dinner reservation. So I was left to mind the store. While I was tidying up the front of the store, a young lady walked in. She had an all-too-familiar aura around her. She began chatting with me and trying on shoes. Eventually, she tried on a pair that she claimed she loved and wanted to show her mom. She walked out the door and disappeared. My mind was racing, and I was getting ready to run after her. But just then, she walked back in, taking them off and placing them on the shelf. I thought to myself, well, that was weird. About 10 minutes later, another guy walked in. Same aura, same sketchy vibes. He spent a few minutes looking around the store before choosing a shoe, trying it on, and casually walking out the door. I ran after him but didn't see anyone in the parking lot. Now I'm worried about the cameras in the store since my manager would definitely see the footage of the guy walking out. I walked back into the store, defeated and nervous. After I finished closing up, I was really worried about how my boss would react to this footage and the stolen merchandise. The next morning, I walked in for my shift, nervously expecting a scolding or worse. My manager called me to the back office. I walked in, expecting the worst. But instead of a scolding, I saw my coworker, who was supposed to be off that night. Turns out, Both the girl and the guy were friends of his, and they set up the whole thing as a prank. My boss thought it was hilarious and had to get it all on tape. They even had a cake ready to apologize for making me worry. We all had a good laugh about it, and the shoes were returned. But from that day on, I learned to be wary of sketchy customers, even if they turn out to be pranksters. It was a lesson in trust and a reminder of the tight-knit family that we had become. About 2 years ago, I was working at a small bookshop in my hometown. We had a handful of regulars, but one of them, in particular, stood out. He was an older gentleman, probably in his late 70s, and he would come in almost every day without fail. He had a kind face, always smiling, and would chat with everyone in the store. His name was Mr. Collins. He loved to read mysteries and thrillers, and would often spend hours browsing through our shelves, looking for new books to devour. One day, Mr. Collins came in looking particularly frail. He moved slower than usual, and his smile seemed a bit forced. I asked if he was okay, and he assured me he was fine, just feeling a bit under the weather. He continued to browse the shelves, but it was clear he wasn't his usual self. As he was leaving, he handed me a small, wrapped package and asked me to keep it safe for him. He said he'd be back for it soon. Days turned into weeks, and Mr. Collins didn't return. I started to worry about him. I tried looking up his contact information in our system, but found nothing useful. One evening, a woman came into the shop. She introduced herself as Mr. Collins' daughter. She told me that her father had passed away shortly after his last visit to the store. She said he had spoken fondly of our little bookshop and the people who worked there. It broke my heart to hear the news, and I expressed my condolences. I remembered the package Mr. Collins had left with me and handed it to his daughter. She opened it right there in the shop. Inside was a beautifully bound journal filled with handwritten notes, thoughts, and reflections. There was also a letter addressed to me and my colleagues, thanking us for the kindness and friendship we had shown him. The letter explained that the journal was a gift for the shop, a way for him to leave a part of himself behind in a place he loved so much. We decided to display the journal in the shop, along with a photo of Mr. Collins. It became a tribute to a man who had touched all our lives in such a meaningful way. Customers would often stop to read his notes, and many were moved by his words. It was a beautiful reminder of the impact we can have on each other's lives, even in the smallest of ways. It was a hot summer day when I had my strangest experience at work. I was managing a small cafe in the heart of the city. We had our usual rush of customers in the morning, but the afternoon was typically quieter. I was behind the counter, preparing some pastries, when a man walked in. He was dressed in a long, dark coat, which was odd considering the heat outside. He also wore sunglasses and a hat, making it difficult to see his face. He approached the counter and asked for a black coffee. I couldn't help but notice how tense he seemed, constantly looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to follow him. I handed him his coffee, and he took a seat in the corner of the cafe, far from the windows. His behavior was strange, but I tried to shrug it off and went back to my work. After a while, 2 men in suits entered the cafe. They looked around briefly before spotting the man in the coat. They approached him, and a heated conversation ensued. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but it was clear that something was very wrong. Suddenly, the man in the coat jumped up, knocking over his chair. The 2 men grabbed him, and a struggle broke out. I was frozen in place, unsure of what to do. The other customers in the cafe were just as startled. One of the men in suits pulled out a badge and identified himself as a federal agent. They managed to subdue the man in the coat and escorted him out of the cafe. The whole incident left everyone in the cafe in shock. Later, one of the agents returned to explain what had happened. It turned out the man in the coat was a fugitive on the run, and the agents had been tracking him for weeks. They apologized for the disturbance and assured us that we were never in any danger. It was a surreal experience, something out of a movie. After that day, I kept a closer eye on the customers who came into the cafe, always wondering if another fugitive might walk through the door. This happened back in 2010. I was working in a hotel in a suburban area, a nice place. When I first started there, I was both a PT front desk clerk and a PT night auditor. For those of you not in hospitality, I closed the day out on the computers on the overnight shift. I had just been promoted to a day job and had a week left at the front desk before I was switching to my Monday through Friday gig, and it was just like any other night. At about 3 a.m., I received a phone call. The guy sounded my age, mid-20s, and attempted to strike up a conversation with me. I have to give my name when answering the phone, so he gets my name, of course, and starts asking me personal questions. Do you have a boyfriend? Would you want to go out for a drink, etc., which were harmless, but nevertheless, I tell him I'm hanging up as I had a job to do. He wouldn't give me a name. Instead, he said, "Why don't you call me John?" I hang up and finish my shift. The next night at about 3:30 a.m., I received another phone call from John. He started off by asking me out for a drink again, to which I declined and hung up the phone. He called back about 5 times that night, each time getting more lewd in his comments, and just tried to keep me talking. He ended his last call with the phrase, "I see you like singing karaoke." I love doing that. Let's go out together sometime. He found me on Twitter. I had just gone out a few nights prior with my friends and posted about it. I asked him how he got my full name, and he wouldn't tell me. I hung up again, and he was done for that night. I deleted my Twitter and Foursquare pages, and when my boss came in at 7 a.m., I told him what had been going on. We told my GM, and my security guard put it into his record. I only worked 2 overnights a week, luckily, but when I came back the next week, so did he. The phone call started at around 3 a.m. and lasted for an hour or so, but this time was a little different. John was angry that I had deleted my accounts, so he couldn't keep an eye on me and make sure I wasn't cheating on him. I told him that I'm not answering the phone anymore. My security guard will be taking all of my calls going forward. The phone was quiet for about 10 seconds, and then he screamed, "You're going to be with me whether or not you like it. I'm coming for you," and hung up the phone. I, of course, called the police. Luckily, I had my security guard there, so I wasn't completely alone, but it must have been a slow night because it took the cops mere minutes to get there. I called my night shift supervisor, who left at 11 p.m., and he managed to calm me down. One cop was nice enough to stay until my shift was done, and with that, I told my boss that even though I had a week left of overnights, I couldn't and wouldn't do it. Thankfully, they understood, and I moved to daytime hours as well as sent an email out to everyone telling them that anyone who called for me was sent directly to the GM. Thankfully, everything stopped after that, minus a few phone calls the security guy got for about the week. He told the guy that I had quit because of him, and the calls stopped. This happened in the fall of 1993 when I was 20 years old. In the interest of context, this was before I started college, and I was working in the material prep department of a plastics factory on the night shift. I was the only woman in the department, and my male coworkers were initially skeptical that I could handle the job, but I proved myself and earned their respect. It was hard work, but on the plus side, it also put me in the best shape of my life. It was also about this time that I dumped my abusive boyfriend. He was verbally, emotionally, and physically abusive, as well as an alcoholic. This fact, more than anything, is probably why I got myself into this situation in the first place. I had just gotten off of work, and it was about 1:30 a.m. My car was running on fumes, so I stopped at a local gas station to fill up. While I was pumping gas, a woman about my age approached me looking nervous and scared. She said that she had been at her boyfriend's house, and they had a fight. She walked up to the gas station to use the payphone and call a friend to pick her up. On her way to the station, a car pulled up as she was walking, and the guys inside started catcalling and harassing her. With a slight movement of her head, she indicated a car that was parked off to the side by the gas station dumpsters. I saw a large light green car, like a Caddy or a Lincoln, with at least 2 or 3 shadowy figures inside. She said they threatened her, and she was too scared to call her friend and wait. The woman was neat, well-dressed, and didn't seem high or drunk or anything like that. She just seemed really nervous and freaked out, so I didn't even hesitate. I finished pumping my gas and told her to hop in the car that I'd take her home. At that time on a weeknight there was little traffic, so I booked it right out of the gas station and asked her where she lived. She kept twisting around in the seat to see if the car was behind us, and when I asked her to put her seatbelt on, she ignored me and kept looking for the car. I assumed she was just scared. A few blocks down the road, however, I noticed she was looking around the car, and she started asking me about money. "Where's your purse? Where's your bag? I need money. You need to give me some money." My stomach sank. I have this woman in my car, and now she's going to rob me. But when I thought about it, robbery just didn't make much sense. I was driving a 1985 Chevette and was wearing my work clothes, a ratty t-shirt and jeans with combat boots. I did not look like a person with a lot of cash, primarily because I wasn't a person with a lot of cash. She twisted around in the seat again and started yelling, "There they are. There they are." She didn't sound scared anymore. I checked the rear view, and sure enough, the light green car was right behind me. She started cackling and bouncing up and down in the seat. She's laughing like crazy, opening the glove box, looking in the back for a bag or purse, telling me all the messed up things these guys are planning to do to me. Now, if I had been smart, I would have just driven to the police station. Actually, if I had been very smart, I would have called the cops from the gas station and waited with her until they arrived. That would have been the intelligent thing to do. Unfortunately, none of this crossed my mind until later. In the moment, I just got really angry. I realized 3 key things all at once. There was an intersection up ahead with cars on either side waiting to cross, and the light had just turned yellow. I had a spare box cutter that I kept for work in the driver's side door compartment. The crazy lady still hadn't put on her seatbelt. I didn't think. I floored it and passed under the yellow light just as it turned red. I glanced back to see if the green car was still behind me, but the cross traffic at the intersection had just started to move, and they hadn't caught up. The woman started yelling. I slammed on the brakes, and she hit the dash and windshield with a solid and viciously satisfying crack. When she rebounded to the passenger seat, I had the box cutter in her face and was screaming some serious batshit crazy stuff. I can't remember exactly what I said, but it was along the lines of "Get the F out of my car before I cut off your face and make you eat it." The crazy screaming and box cutter combo worked. She grabbed blindly at the handle and popped the door open. I started shoving and punching her until she fell out the door to the curb. I stomped on the gas, got to the next turn, and squealed around it with the passenger's door still open. I made a few more turns because I was afraid that the green car might catch up to me. After a little while, I stopped to close the passenger door, and then I cut across town and got onto the highway to go home. I was on the highway for about 5 minutes before the shake started. I pulled off to the shoulder to calm down, and then I drove home. I told my sister I was living with her temporarily after the breakup with my ex about everything that had just happened. She wrapped me in a tight bear hug while simultaneously yelling about how stupid I was for not going to the police. I've never been so glad to be yelled at in my life. This happened in the summer of 2018. I was 18 years old and had just graduated from high school. I decided to take a year off before going to college and got a job as a waitress at a local diner. The diner was located in a small town, and we had a lot of regulars. One of the regulars was a middle-aged man who came in almost every day. He always sat at the counter and made small talk with the waitresses. He seemed harmless, and we all knew him by name. One day, he came in during my shift and sat at the counter as usual. He started talking to me about random things, and then he asked me if I had a boyfriend. I told him I did, and he seemed disappointed. He then started asking me more personal questions, like where I lived and what my plans were for the weekend. I was starting to feel uncomfortable, so I tried to change the subject, but he kept steering the conversation back to my personal life. After he left, I mentioned it to my manager, who told me to keep an eye on him. The next day, he came in again during my shift. This time, he didn't sit at the counter. Instead, he sat in one of the booths and just stared at me the whole time. Every time I looked in his direction, he was watching me. I was getting really creeped out, so I told my manager again. She said she would talk to him if he made me uncomfortable again. A few days later, I was walking to my car after my shift when I noticed the man standing by his car, which was parked next to mine. He smiled and said hello, but I didn't respond. I quickly got into my car and locked the doors. As I was backing out of the parking space, he walked up to my window and knocked on it. I rolled down the window a little bit and asked him what he wanted. He said he just wanted to talk to me and asked if I wanted to go for a drive with him. I told him no, and that I had to go home. He then asked if he could follow me home so we could talk there. I told him no again and drove off. I was really shaken up by the whole experience, and when I got home, I told my parents what had happened. They were furious and told me to quit my job immediately. I didn't want to quit because I needed the money, but I agreed to take a few days off. When I went back to work, my manager told me that the man had been coming in every day asking about me. She had told him that I wasn't working and that he should leave me alone. He eventually stopped coming in, but I was still really scared. I ended up quitting the job a few weeks later because I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. I never saw him again, but the experience left me paranoid and anxious for a long time.